Here we go. Okay, sorry for the slight delay, everybody. We're ready to get started. Um, uh, there are new changes to the platform that Web Yeshiva is using, and that's what caused us a slight delay. Hello, everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, for webyeshiva.org, and we are studying Rabbi Sadia Gaon's Emunot V'Deot. We are still in the introduction. It's an 8-part introduction that we have in the Emunot V'Deot. And if you're coming upon this class for the first time, I recommend that you listen to the past lectures that we've had, so the shiurim that we've had so far, which will give you the background information. I just want us to get our bearings for today and see where we've been up until now. And so I'm going to share my screen with you, and I have to here. Let's see, share content. It says, and there we go. Okay, so again, everything a little bit new here. What we're going to be doing is Rabbi Sadia, in the course of his introduction to Emunot V'Deot, on what we know and what we believe in Judaism, he first has to explain to his reader what is the basis of knowledge. And that's what we've already started in our previous discussions. In the 5th part of the introduction, Rabbi Sadia has already revealed to us that there are 4 basic sources of knowledge. How does a human mind comprehend or cognize things, attain knowledge? And we started off with clarifying that the word i'atakad in Arabic that Rabbi Sadia has been using is the word for de'ah or da'at. How does a human being acquire knowledge? And so we just started in our last year, which was 3 weeks ago, we started an explanation as to the 4 sources of knowledge. Rabbi Sadia Gaon had said that the three conventional sources of knowledge that is universal to all philosophers are, number 1, what we would call yedi'at hanir'eh, a knowledge of that which can be perceived by the senses, what we would call empirical knowledge, or what is sometimes known in philosophical circles as a posteriori knowledge, which means that through my senses being exposed to external stimuli, I attain knowledge of the world that is around me. I feel, I see, I smell, I hear, and those are my sensory instruments that bring me information, that bring me knowledge. Then we have what's called rational knowledge, or yedi'at haseichel, or what we could also call a priori knowledge, which is that there is a belief, and this is debated again among the Renaissance scholars, the Renaissance philosophers, Locke and Hume and Kant and Descartes, that the mind has the capacity to infer certain truths without any external stimuli whatsoever. That's what's called yedi'at haseichel. And it seems from Rabbi Sadia's language that he's provided with us so far is that this kind of knowledge is the intuition that a human being has about, mostly that what we've seen so far at least, is on moral issues. I know the difference between right and wrong, not because I've experienced those things, but there are certain instincts within a human being that guide him or her to know certain areas of moral prudence, that which is good and that which is evil. The third source of knowledge is knowledge compelled by logic. What he had said in Hebrew is yedi'at ma shehechrech mevi alav. And he's going to give us some examples of this, but the basic idea is that if I've already established that A is true, using one of the 2 prior methods of knowledge, either empirical knowledge or rational knowledge, and B must necessarily follow logically from the establishment of A, then I know that B is true as well, using a logical process of concluding B from A. Not that I've ever perceived B, not that I infer or intuit that B is true, but if A is true, then B must be true. That's a knowledge of B that comes through logic. Okay, so those are the three classical, conventional ways that a human being, a human mind, can obtain knowledge of anything in the world. He said that other cultures and ideologies reject one or more of these sources of knowledge. We, however, the community of those who unify God, substantiate the three sources of correct knowledge, but we add a fourth source. In other words, Rabbi Saadia Gaon wants to make sure that no Jew ever mistakenly thinks that the Torah asks you to believe in something that is counterintuitive or counter-empirical. The Torah also is based on principles of logic and knowledge gathering that are based on common sense. So we accept those three sources of knowledge, but we add a fourth source. It is a source that was proven to us by the other three sources of knowledge. And of course, it's because we know that we've had the experience of revelation at Mount Sinai. It is our belief in an authentic tradition, that is the Torah, which is based on our sensory knowledge and our rational knowledge to know that this is something that is good. And we will explain this further, he says, in the third essay of the Emunot V'Deot, which, as we know, is broken down into 10 essays. Now, just to clarify a little bit further, empirical knowledge refers to any knowledge a person obtains by means of the five senses. Rational knowledge refers to ideas that emerge in a person's mind independent of his senses. And knowledge compelled by logic refers to that which, if a person were to not accept this knowledge, he would have to deny his rationality or his senses. Since this is impossible, he is compelled to substantiate that idea. So Adkan is our review of that which we saw in our last session, which was from the beginning of section 5 of the introduction. I apologize for my slightly hoarse voice. I hope everyone is able to follow me. Now, the Torah corroborates. Now we're going to continue along in section 5. We won't be able to finish section 5 today because it is quite lengthy, but we'll make some good progress. The Torah corroborates the first three sources of knowledge as being authentic. And so what Rabbi Saadia is now going to tell us is that if we look into the verses of Tanakh, we will see that the Torah too believes in empirical knowledge, rational knowledge, and knowledge that is derived from logic. The first source of knowledge, empirical knowledge from the senses, is confirmed by the Torah. We thus have a verse in the book of Tehillim, in the book of Psalms, which describes the five known senses: taste, sight, hearing, smell, touch. And then, interestingly enough, even though conventional wisdom tells us that there are only five senses, the verse in Tehillim tells us that there are seven senses. Now, let's see what exactly that is. First of all, the verse is in Kapitel Kuftet Vav, Psalms 115, verses 5 through 7. We should be somewhat familiar with this because we say this in the Hallel. And what the verse is describing are the false gods of the other nations. And in the course of describing these false gods and how they are of no help to the worshiper of those gods, the verse describes their various imitated sensory organs that do not provide them with any sensory perception. Pe lahem v'lo yidaberu. They have a mouth, but they cannot speak. Einayim lahem v'lo yir'u. They have eyes, but they cannot see. Oznayim lahem v'lo yishmo. They have ears, but they cannot hear. Af lahem v'lo yirichun. They have a nose, they cannot smell. Yedehem v'lo yimishun. They have hands and they cannot feel anything. Raglehem v'lo yahalechu. They have feet but cannot walk, or legs and cannot walk. Lo yehegu bigaronam. And they cannot enunciate anything in their throats. So Reb Saadia takes a little bit of a license, and he starts off that the pe lahem v'lo yidaberu refers to that they have a mouth but cannot speak, meaning they cannot taste. Now, I'm not really sure how he finesses that, but perhaps it could be that when a person wishes to speak after tasting something, he expresses the flavor that he has just tasted. That seems to be the way he's understanding. So the first five in this list refer to taste. Einayim is sight. Oznayim is hearing. Af refers to the nose, and it refers to smelling. And Yedehem, their hands, refers to the sense of touch. Well, what are the two extra words? Raglehem v'lo yahalechu describes how the feet cause motion, which creates the sense of heaviness and lightness. So Reb Sadia suggests that according to the Psalms, this is an additional sense of a sensory perception. How does a person know how heavy or light they are? The way that you know this is how easy or difficult it is for you to move. If I move with great difficulty, this is an indication that I personally have a heaviness about me. And if I move with great ease, like a leopard, let's say, then that is heavy kal kanesher, as we say, or heavy kal kanesher, be as light as an eagle. If I can fly, or if I can move very quickly, then that's a sign that I am very light. And so that in itself is a sense. It is a sense of self-awareness of my weight and my ability to move. So that's another sensory perception. And lo yehagu bigronam, they cannot enunciate with their throats, refers to the sense of communication. We normally don't classify that as a sense, but human beings have this added sensory ability of being able to interact with each other via the means of communication. So those are the seven senses. So the point that Rebbe Sadia wants to make here is that the Torah itself, the verses of Tanakh, corroborate the fact that human beings obtain knowledge through their senses. Whether they're 5 or they're 7, that's a side issue. Next, the Torah also corroborates the second source of knowledge, which is rationalism, what we call the yedi'at hasechel, or a priori knowledge, the ability to intuit ideas. Because it says in Proverbs, Ki emet yehegech ki, my palate can communicate truth, v'to'avat sefatai resha, and the abomination of my lips can also detect evil. B'tzedek kol imrei fi, that with justice are all the words of my mouth. In other words, a person is capable of intuiting that which is good and evil, true or perverse. And that is something that you don't need sensory perception for. It is an inbred instinct or intuition that every human being has, and that's what he calls yedi'at hasechel, something that the human mind can perceive or intuit without sensory perception. And then he says, the third source of knowledge, the Torah also corroborates the third source of knowledge, that which is derived by logical necessity. That is to say, whatever leads to the rejection of the senses or rational intuition must be false. In other words, the mind works logically. So if there is something that is suggested that calls upon me to reject my senses or to reject my intuition, then I know that it must be rejected. Okay, so to prove this, he cites a verse from the book of Job, where it says, Toref nafsho be'apo, that if a person, this is Job's friend rebuking him, because Job was suggesting that God is non-existent in his life, or that God has forsaken him and is no longer providential. And so his friend says to him, if a person wishes to become very, very upset, just because you're upset about something, does that mean that we can deny the fact that God is no longer present in our existence? That's the way the Metzudas David understands the meaning of this verse. And what Reb Sadia is deriving from that verse is that what Eov's friend was essentially telling him is that just because you're indignant about something because of your own personal pain does not mean that I have to accept your surmisal that God has forsaken this world, because I can very easily perceive and intuit that God is a righteous judge and is present in my world. Okay, and so this verse is demonstrating that something which a person has already perceived with his own sensory perception, if he encounters a proposition that goes counter to what he's already established from his own senses, he immediately rejects that. So that is indicative of a source of knowledge that is based on logic. And to show the untenability of rejecting what one knows from rational intuition, another verse from Eov, which says, V'im lo Efo mi yachziveni, v'yasem la'al milati. And as the Mitzudat David explains, V'im tomeru ein hadavar kain, ayepo ha'ish umihu ze asher yechazevoti, lomar shelo nimtza marbit tova v'shalva la'anashim ka'ela. Meaning that, again, responding to a theological challenge, Hashem responds to Eov that you clearly intuit that justice prevails in the world, that there is a sense of goodness, that ultimately there is good in the world. And no one can take that away from me. No one can deny me a knowledge of that which is good. As the Mitzudat David says, based on this verse, it's impossible to deny that which is well accepted by the human mind. So that again is showing that the Tanakh believes that a person can infer factual knowledge using a logical process. Let's go on. Scripture in Job not only corroborates empirical knowledge, it also confirms that all areas of scientific knowledge are built upon what we perceive empirically. And so this, Reb Saad, is just adding to the argument that you will never find in Tanakh anything that is going to contradict what modern scientists or philosophers propose. So, for example, he brings a verse in Eov that says, Shim'u chachamim mili v'yodi'im ha'azinu li, listen, wise men, my words, anyone who is capable of understanding, hear what I have to say. Ki ozen milin tivchan b'cheik itam le'echol. The ear has the capacity to discriminate and to discern, and the palate tastes to know what to eat. In other words, this verse clearly confirms that the way that we attain knowledge and know how to live our lives is through our sensory perception. Furthermore, Eov also confirms that the Torah itself is a reliable source of knowledge. So this fourth source of knowledge built into the Tanakh itself, into the verses in Eov, is Eov says, all you have to do is look in the Torah in order to obtain truth as well. Let me show you something important. That wise men know to transmit that which they have received from their forefathers. That is another way of saying that we have something that is called a Mesorah, a tradition that we've received from our ancestors, that is the Torah. Lahem levadam nitna haaretz, velo avad zar betocham. This is a unique tradition. It is not something that was given to anyone except to the Jewish people, but it is nonetheless a reliable source of truthful knowledge. So now that we've clarified these four sources of knowledge using the verses in Eov, we will explain how to learn from these sources. In other words, now let's get into the technical aspect of how you use your senses and how you use your rationality and how you use your logic and how you use the Torah in order to process truth, in order to process things that you want to obtain in your mind. So regarding empirical knowledge, whatever we perceive with our senses, provided that we are sufficiently proximal to the item being sensed, we can rest assured that our perception is accurate and true without a doubt. So I have on my desk, let's say, I have on my desk a stapler, and I perceive the stapler. I see it. It looks like a stapler. It feels like a stapler. When I squeeze the handle, it dispenses staplers. So my sensory perception is reliable to tell me that that is indeed a stapler. So I can rest assured that my perception is undoubtedly accurate, provided that I am close enough to the object that I am perceiving. Sometimes I may be very far away, and then I can't be absolutely assured. Now, this is provided that we know the difference between what is real and what is illusion. We should, for example, be able to distinguish that the image in the mirror is not a real thing, but only the reflection of a real thing. Nor should we be misled by distortions that occur when we place long objects in the water and they appear much shorter, because there's distortion, sensory distortion that is created by water tension and the prism effect that water creates. So for example, if you stick an oar into the water, it looks like the ore bends and becomes shorter, when in reality it has not changed its shape at all. As long as we are sufficiently aware of these kinds of illusions, we can reliably trust our senses. We will thus not be led astray as the Moabites were when seeing the water refracting the light of the sun, thinking that the setting sun, which projected a red color, was causing the water to have a reddish appearance, and the Moabites concluded that the water was red. What Reb Sadia is referring to is an episode in the second book of Kings, Malachim Bet, chapter 3, where the king of Israel and the king of Judea collaborate together to go to war against the Moabites. The Moabites encounter, they take a much smaller army, thinking that the kingdoms of Israel and Judea will not collaborate because they're enemies, and there's this civil war between the two of them. And as a result, they take a modest army, go out to fight against whoever they think they will encounter. They see the water looks red, and they think, therefore, that the Israelites and the Judeans are fighting against each other and shedding their own blood. And so, therefore, they feel overly confident that they will encounter someone easy to defeat when they meet up with whoever they meet up with. And that was their mistake. Their mistake was not using their senses properly, looking at the water, thinking that it's red when it really was not. So again, all Reb Sadia is pointing out is that we have to have a sufficient amount of experience and aptitude in knowing when our senses are bringing us a vision or something that we hear that is accurate and that is not an illusion. Regarding a priori knowledge of the rational faculty, anything, and this is a little bit controversial because he says anything that our mind conceives with sound logic and which is free from false constructs should be regarded as true knowledge. And essentially, Reb Sadia is suggesting that it is possible for a person to intuit that which is moral and that which is just. And that's not so easily convincing, because we know that today so many people have convinced themselves of things that are moral and just and correct when they're really not. So we have to really try and unpack this a little bit. And he says this is assuming that we properly know how to reason and we are wary of avoiding false imaginings and dreams. And he launches into a discussion of how sometimes people can have false imaginings and dreams, thinking that they are real when they're really false. This is necessary to observe, since there are people who are misled by their dreams, sometimes thinking that what they have dreamt is real. In reality, though, people dream of things that they were thinking of during the day, as it says in the book of Kohelet, Ki ba hachalom berov inyan, that people dream about what they were thinking about during the day in their daily affairs. The Gemara makes a point of saying this in Brachot, and I'll mention that in just a moment. Alternatively, one may have illusory dreams due to food that he ate before sleeping, as it says in Isaiah, that sometimes a person will fall asleep because he's very hungry, thinking that he's eating in his dream, and he wakes up and he still has an empty stomach. So a lot of times people delude themselves, thinking that something is real when it's really not. Others may conjure false images based on a chemical imbalance in their body. A person may become manic, or a person may become depressed, and that causes them to come to certain conclusions. And this is something that he cites from the book of Job. As a result of chemical imbalances, people may have visions or conclusions of terrifying things. As Job says, I thought that when I went to bed, I would find harmony and rest and tranquility, but but in reality, my dreams tormented me and did not allow me to have any rest. So even a person who may be in a state where everything should be positive in his mind, sometimes people have distorted images of reality because of their depression or because of their manic state. So I guess really what Reb Sadia is just pointing out is that we have to be careful with this faculty of when we say that the mind can intuit and rationalize certain things a priori, because there are so many dangers and so many pitfalls which could cause a person to come to some distorted conclusions. And at the same time as saying that dreams can lead a person astray, we submit that some dreams can contain heavenly messages. As it says again, once again in Job, that people are revealed true things from the angels when they go to sleep. Bachalom chezyon laila, that a person can have a true vision of truth. Now, all of the things that Reb Sadia has mentioned and inferred from the scripture are also found in the 9th chapter of Tractate Brachot, which talks all about dreams. So, for example, the Gemara in Brachot says that Chalom echad mishishim l'nevuah, that a dream is 1/60th of a prophecy. So, and the Gemara also confirms all of the other things that Reb Sadia said about how food can affect a person having bizarre dreams and a person's chemical imbalance as well. Now, let's go to regarding knowledge inferred by logical necessity, that when our senses verify that A is true, and the only way that A can be true is if B is also true, then we must believe in B. This is the third type of knowledge that is attained through logic. So even though I may have only perceived A to be true, but if logic dictates that if A, then B must also be true. Once A is true, 1B may result, or they may be multiples, B, C, D, E, etc. Logically, it makes no difference how many outgrowths of A there are, one or many. Now, here are some examples of A leading to only 1B. Let's see, we see smoke. I look out in the distance and I see a house that has smoke coming out of it. We must assume that when there's smoke, there's fire. Or let's say we hear a human voice beyond a wall. We must conclude that there is a human being on the other side of the wall if I've heard a human voice. So these are things that are very simplistic, but Rabbi Sadia really is providing us with a foundation to understand how humans cognize, how we obtain knowledge. And we don't necessarily think about these things when we conclude certain things are true, but by using this very, very simplistic and very carefully dissected and broken down presentation, he is trying to help us think like philosophers. And an example of how A can lead to more than 1B, when we see a living creature intake food in its mouth, and then we observe sometime later that that being is excreting that food in its tongue, we must conclude that 4 logical conclusions from that one observation. So it's not that A necessarily logically leads to B, but A leads to B, C, D, and E. Why is that? It's because Reb Sadia is referring to the medieval 4 digestive forces, which means that in medieval science, the belief was that there are 4 independent forces within the body that create the whole digestive process. In medieval medicine, the process of digestion and waste expulsion was explained through 4 primary forces or faculties or virtues. These were based on Galen and Aristotle's medical theories, which dominated medieval European and Islamic medicine. The 4 digestive forces were the attractive force, that which draws food into the stomach, the retentive force, once food has entered the stomach, this force holds it in place, the digestive force, which is responsible for breaking down food into usable substances, and the expulsive force, which is responsible for eliminating waste, ejecting waste out of the body. Okay, now, we're running a little bit out of time, so I just want to conclude with the next piece. There are other instances where we observe something empirically, and we must create rules of science in order to make sense of what we have perceived. In other words, sometimes I will perceive A, and I infer from A that there must be certain forces at play that are causing this phenomenon A. That's all Reb Sadia says. Again, it's logical conclusions. And sometimes what he's suggesting is that because A behaves in such a complex way, it must be that there are multiple forces at play. We may be compelled to resort to many such rules in order to make sense of our observations. All these rules would then be confirmed as true and correct. For example, we see the moon rise and set every day, and yet the moon's motion is uneven. Sometimes it travels a longer route, sometimes a shorter route. By this we mean that there are 28 known stations that the moon traverses every evening. Sometimes it reaches a station more quickly and sometimes more slowly. And the medieval understanding was that the moon goes to either 27 or 28, depending upon the different traditions, different stations over the course of a nighttime before it ends up setting and the sun starts to rise. We must conclude that each of these stations has a different scientific effect upon the moon, which influences its motion. And here Rav Sadia is referring to what's called lunar mansions from the medieval scientific point of view. They were originally known as the 27 stations of the moon, but Rav Sadia calls them 28 because there's a bit of a machloket among medieval thinkers as to whether there are 27 or 28. They're divisions of the sky along the moon's orbit used in medieval and ancient astrology, astronomy, and calendars. These divisions originated from ancient Babylonian, Indian, and Arabic traditions and were widely used in medieval Europe and the Islamic world. So it's the origins and meaning. The concept comes from the idea that the moon moves across the sky, completing its orbit in about 27.3 days. So ancient astronomers divided the ecliptic, the apparent path of the moon and planets, into 27 sections, each associated with specific stars. These stations were used for astrological predictions, timing rituals, and navigation. Rabbi Sadia is simply saying this: the fact that the moon's orbit or ecliptic is erratic in its speed and in its trajectory indicates that the moon is being influenced by external factors. And the theory was that these 27 or 28 stations or mansions where the moon stopped at each place was having a different influence on the moon and was thus responsible for the moon's constantly changing state of motion. And so, for example, in the Chinese system, there were 28 divisions, and I'm not sure why Rabbi Sadia says 28. Apparently, the Ibn Ezra also believed that there were 28 stations according to Rav Kafich, but this is all getting somewhat technical. The point that he's trying to make is that when I perceive something with my senses, like the motion of the moon, I can infer certain rules about science based on those observations. Now, of course, we look at this today and we say, well, this is somewhat archaic. This is anachronistic, because today we would look at the moon and say the moon is not being influenced by forces other than the force of gravity that is pulling it in its orbit around the Earth, and any kind of erratic motion is based upon a function of the waves of the ocean or the gravitational pull or the uneven state of orbit that the moon may have. I don't even understand myself how science would explain the erratic motion of the moon. However, we certainly wouldn't infer that there are 27 or 28 stations which the moon passes by that causes it to change. However, the idea is still valid. The idea being that a person can induct from observation and come to a certain conclusion based on those observations that there must be certain principles that are at play. Now, this is a perfect example that we can't necessarily prove that, and we can't know it with absolute certainty, but it's fair and reasonable for a person to conclude certain aspects of knowledge based on what he's perceived. Okay, we're going to have to stop it here for today. I know this was a little bit technical, but we will be getting more non-technical material, more tachlis material, but we really have to go through this in order to be able to get to the more of the meat of what Rav Sadia wants to present us. So we're going to hold it here for now. Unfortunately, I have to run to another appointment at this moment, but we will continue B'ezrat Hashem next week, and then we'll talk about taking a break for Pesach. But hopefully we'll see you all next week. Have a great week, everybody, and take care.